What I'm going to talk about this morning is a quick look at the project history, the basic capabilities. We'll start talking about the Raspberry Pi 4 and the Pluto and the differences between the two versions of Portsdown that we're now running. We'll look at the new features and functions and then look at what's coming ahead and some advice for new builders, where to start. So the Portsdown, what is it? Well, it's an entry-level, simple digital amateur TV exciter. It gets you up to around the milliwatt level of digital ATV. You can now plug a mini tuner into it, and it's also a digital ATV receiver. It's intended for portable or home use, but particularly suitable for portable use. I've also tried to put some other bits in there. You know, Raspberry Pi is really useful and there are other things it can do. And I'll talk about some of those later. Lastly, it's an appliance, this concept of an appliance, something you plug in and it just works. It is not an all-singing, all-dancing Windows or Linux computer. It does what it's intended to do and only what it's intended to do. And what it's not a broadcast quality H.265 transmitter. So you'll see quite a lot of signals on QO100, not so many locally terrestrial, I dare say, that are really high quality H.265. The Portsdown can't do that. It's only a Raspberry Pi. The guys running H.265 on QO100 are using graphics cards and heating up their shacks with them. And it's not like a Windows PC. You can't just plug and play hardware, and I'll come back to that. It's useful to have a quick look at the project history. Everest F5OEO is really the godfather, the grandfather of the project. I took some of his software back in late 2016 and during 2017 developed it into something that was reproducible and we could help people build. By 2018 we had a mature capability. We were selling filter modulator cards and it would also drive DATV Express. The operating system on a Raspberry Pi changes over time, just like Windows goes from XP through Vista 7, 8, 10. The operating system on the Raspberry Pi changes as well. And we went through, we started on Jessie. In 2019, we had to do a step change onto Stretch. And the reason we have to make these changes is all the supporting software that we use is based on the new operating system, so we have to keep up with the times to make it work. And we introduced an initial Lime SDR capability which brought us DVB-S2 on Stretch in 2019. Late in 2019, early 2020, we moved on to Buster, the operating system, and that brought us a more mature Lime SDR capability. During those transitions, I changed the menus to be more complex. There are now about 40 odd menus in the Portsdown, so quite a lot to keep up with there. And then earlier this year, we moved on to a system that works on the Raspberry Pi 4, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so what are the core capabilities? DVB-S and DVB-S2 transmission, MPEG-2 and H.264 encoding, and video from a PiCam or an EasyCap. And those are the things I've tried to make work all the time. Just a note on the PiCams, you can use any of the Raspberry Pi PiCams, the early versions, the version 2 illustrated there, or the HQ cam, they all work. EasyCaps, a bit more difficult. We purchased overall 500 EasyCaps from China, and that source has now dried up. I'm trying to make it work with another EasyCap, and when that gets to the top of the list, and we'll start selling them in the shop again. The Raspberry Pi 4 came in with great fanfare just over a year ago, actually. It's a faster processor than the Raspberry Pi 3. And one of the things that seemed to be a big attraction was it had a software decoder for H.265. And that H.265 encoding of video enables us to put more video in less bandwidth. Less bandwidth means less power required, which means greater range. So that was one of the great attractions of it. I'll come back to that in a minute. It has got USB 3 and gigabit Ethernet. We really don't use those capabilities. It generates a lot more heat because it has a higher power consumption, and the graphics gets hot as well, as does the networking. One difference from the Raspberry Pi 3, the Raspberry Pi 3 had power protection on the input and dropped a bit of voltage between the USB, I can't remember, the micro USB socket that was used for power input and the rest of the circuitry. The Pi 4 doesn't have that, which means there is no advantage to be gained from using the USB-C to feed power into it. You can actually feed power into the GPIO pins, and this is the method I now recommend. Saves you messing around with USB-C connectors, and you go straight in on the pins. The main problem we faced on moving to the Raspberry Pi 4 was it has no OpenVG graphics. Now, all the menus you're familiar with on the old Portsdown were built using a graphics system called OpenVG, originally designed for mobile phones about 15 years ago, and Raspberry Pi Foundation dropped support for it. And that caused a major problem for me in that I had to rewrite all the graphics from scratch. There's no MPEG-2 hardware decoder, so there's no need for a license for that decoder anymore. It's fast enough to do it in software. Once we started playing with the hardware H.265 decoder, we found the hardware decoder. I said software earlier, my apologies for that, I meant hardware. We found it had some limitations. It did not decode all H.265 signals properly. And we have found that it's actually better to use a software H.265 decoder, and that works perfectly adequately as long as you're only decoding 1 or 2 streams. And no doubt Brian will mention that at the end of the day. The last thing is video output has changed. So composite video output is more difficult from the Raspberry Pi 4. You can make it work with some applications, but I haven't yet made it work with Portsdown. I do intend to re-attack on that and have another go, but not managed to sort that one out yet. Let's compare then Portsdown 2020 and the Portsdown 4. Portsdown 2020 is compatible with all the old hardware, the filter modulator boards, even Digilight. I was pleased to hear the other day it still runs with Digilight. You can use the 3.5-inch screen that you see at the bottom left here, or the Raspberry Pi Foundation 7-inch screen. And it does do composite video out. It's not very good as acting as a video monitor. If I try and feed comp video directly from an EasyCap and try and display it on the screen, I have to resize it, and the resizing is just too difficult for the processor. So that's why the screen, the actual image size is quite small even on a 7-inch screen. And of course, those of you who've tried to play video on the 3.5-inch screen will know it only updates about 3 times a second. So it's jerker vision. The Portsdown 4 though, I have built the Pluto capability into that, and we'll come to that in a moment. I decided it was too much code to maintain everything for the filter modulator board, the Digilight, and all that old legacy hardware, and too much testing to maintain that. So those have been dropped from the Portsdown 4. To give you an idea, the main application that I maintain in Portsdown in Portsdown 2020 is 21,000 lines of code. Portsdown 4, I managed to get it down to 20,000 lines. I was really pleased with myself, but it's still an awful lot to maintain. Additionally, I decided 7-inch screen is the way to go. And one of the reasons for that was to keep it compatible with Colin G4EML's excellent Langston microwave transceiver. A bit more on that later. I've already mentioned the problem with composite video, but the one thing with the Portsdown 4, if you go to menu 2, you'll find there's a whole row of monitors that you can select there. So you can take EasyCap video input and sound and display that. You can take streamed HDMI from an LKV373A and display that. And actually, those of you who are watching on the streamer, the video for the streamer is coming through an LKV373A and into a Portsdown and then streaming to BATC from that. I mentioned it's Langston compatible. Those of you who haven't heard of the Langston, it's a microwave transceiver designed by Colin G4EML, and it uses the Pluto as the RF source, and it will work on all bands from 70 megs up to 5.6 gigs. FM, SSB, CW, a really impressive piece of kit. And my main Portsdown 4 is compatible with both, and you can just switch between the two. I mentioned Pluto then. The Pluto, thanks to some more new software from Evereast, you can load some special firmware on the Pluto and connect it by USB to a Portsdown, and it will do H.264 transmissions. Now, I mentioned earlier that people use high-end graphics cards on their PCs, and this Pluto capability is also good for H.265 Full HD, and people will see that on QO100. The LKV373 HDMI device at bottom left there can be used for either streaming or feeding the Pluto, or a monitor. I've also put in a signal generator there, and if I just cease screen sharing just a moment, I can give you a quick demo of the Pluto signal generator. So let's change camera. Okay, oh dear, I didn't really want that. I'm going to have to hold the camera. We had a late change here. So there's my Portsdown 4. If you go to menu 2, you see the button at the top left there, almost top left, is signal generator, and you get into the Portsdown 4 signal generator menu. Sorry about the lighting. You can output to an ADF4351, the Pluto 5th harmonic, so you can go up to about 30 gigs on that, DATV Express, or an Elcom microwave signal source. Let's go for Pluto and go into control. You have to calibrate the Pluto first. That puts out a little power pulse, so it's a separate thing. And once you've done that, you can then just press start, and you can select any frequency, and you can adjust both frequency and level on that one. And as you can see, we can take it right up to 5 point, yeah, it will go up to 6 gigs at the top end there. And that just comes out of the socket on the Pluto. Right, back to screen sharing, stand by. Okay, and for the Pluto on that one, I've just got it wired up to this fella here by USB. So that's the Pluto signal generator in there. Lastly, there is no need for a USB hub. Just going to share that screen again. Like so. No need for a USB hub. Remember, the power protection isn't there. You can get plenty of power out of the USBs, and in fact the Pluto works a lot better on directly connected. Now, the Pluto. I realise this isn't quite documented as well as it could be now, but we'll get there. You need to extend the frequency range of your Pluto. The original Plutos had a different SDR chip in them, and you can still use the lesser SDR chip in there to use the full frequency range. You're also able to enable the second processor. There are 2 processors inside the Pluto, but the key thing is you have to load every DATV firmware. The firmware I currently use is for the Brave firmware of 5th of February 2020. If your IP address of your home network is 192.168.2.1, you need to change the IP address of your Pluto. And you can use it with the Portsdown for H.264. You can use it with the Langston. You might want to consider swapping out the TCXO to make it more stable for that, or you can use it for the Pluto signal generator. Just going to check something over here. Oh, that's all right. Okay. I thought I might have had a problem there. Right. HDMI input then. This is a fast-moving field. There are lots of new HDMI dongles coming on the market, mainly driven by people wanting to stream their gaming. My current approach is to use the LKV373A. It works well. It sits on a network. You can monitor it by VLC on a PC. But I know it's not everybody's favorite. However, HDMI transmissions, even though we can get 1080p into the Portsdown, the transmit quality is limited by the H.264 encoder in the Raspberry Pi. And if you really want the good transmissions, you need to use something like a Jetson or a graphics card. But as I said, Portsdown is entry level. Okay. This is always quite an emotive subject, non-standard hardware. My view is don't. The Portsdown is an appliance. It's designed to work with certain hardware. But if you really need to use non-standard hardware, say perhaps that audio capture device on the left, try to make it work by modifying the software yourself. If you do that though, your modifications will be overwritten by the next update. The way around that is work out what the modifications are, send them to me, and if I can, I'll include them in the core. But I still can't test unless I've got the hardware. So that's why I discourage people from using non-standard hardware. Let's talk about the receiver in the Portsdown. It uses the same long mind core written by Heather, we're going to hear about later, as the RIDE receiver, which we're also going to hear about later. It works well both on the Portsdown 2020 and on the Portsdown 4. There are 3 players built into Portsdown. I hazard that most people only use the VLC with FFmpeg player. The other two are in there more as let's see what works experiment. VLC with a hardware decoder or OMX player. Be aware you can also play to a UDP stream. Now that has another function in that when you're playing to a UDP stream, the MER is displayed in large characters on the screen. So that if you need to peek up a dish or an aerial or something, if you select play to UDP stream, you get big numbers with the MER on the screen to help you peek up. That of course is even bigger on the beacon MER button. I managed to get the overlay to work on on VLC, so that you do get information about the signal for the first 10 seconds or so when a signal locks up on the receiver. You can select that by tapping the left side of the screen or not. I can't make it left justify. If anybody can make it left justify, I'd be really pleased. So it's center justified, but it works. Don't forget the other things the Portsdown can do. You know, we can do the stream receiver. We can do the Portsdown SigGen, which you've just seen demonstrated. It can do range and bearing calculations. So if you've got your locator in there on menu 2, there are a couple of range and bearing calculators to enable you to sort out your bearings. Again, they're really aimed at portable use. It's got the video monitors in there and the ability to screenshot. If you touch the bottom left-hand corner of the screen while you are receiving somebody, it will take an image of the screen. The screen will actually, on the Portsdown 4, flash slightly, and those snaps are then available for you to download off the Portsdown. You can control a Jetson to do H.265 encoding, as I documented in the last CQTV. And it's also got an RTL-FM receiver in there, if you've got an RTL-FM dongle in there. So what am I aiming at in the future? I have done some work on getting Freak Show back in there. This used to be a simple spectrum display. W7QT in the States about a couple of years ago did some work on improving this and make it into more of a pan adapter type display like this. And this is a screenshot I took day before yesterday of how that's going to look. That needs an RTL SDR to do the receiving. I'd dearly love it to get it working on a Pluto or a Lime SDR, but just aren't enough hours in the day or enough brain cells in my head, one of the two, to make that work. I'd like to be able to drive an ADF 5355. That's the big brother of the ADF 4351 from the signal generator. That's nearly there, not quite ready for release yet. Transmit video quality, I'm always striving to improve that. There's been some people saying, wouldn't it be nice to have a web interface for Portsdown? Yes, it would. I don't have the skill set to write that. Volunteers required, please. Also, QuickTune. People are using QuickTune with their mini tuners on PCs. Be nice to have QuickTune working with the receiver. Yep, would be nice. Again, needs writing. The latest buzz has been about the CM4, Computing Module 4. For those of you who don't know what this is, Raspberry Pi Foundation have, for most of their Raspberry Pi variants, have produced an industrial version of the Raspberry Pi. For Raspberry Pi 3 there was a Compute Module 3, and indeed that was used by Lime Microsystems in their LimeNet Micro, which some of you are using for TV. The Computing Module 4 brings the Raspberry Pi 4 capabilities to a compute module. It's not compatible with Compute Module 3. It's mechanically very different. I've had a look at this. I think if you put a Compute Module 4 on one of its motherboards, there's no reason why it shouldn't work as a Portsdown. However, I think it costs more and doesn't really do us anything. What it would do is if we were to put it on its own printed circuit board and bring all the connectors out, we could make a Portsdown using a Compute Module 4. However, I really don't think that's worth the effort for what you'd gain. So at the moment, that's not on my radar for future enhancements. So those of you who haven't got a Portsdown but are thinking of, well, perhaps this is the way to go, what do I build? Do you build a Portsdown 2020 or do you build a Portsdown 4? I think you really need to build a Portsdown 4. I did have a question from David earlier in the week whether it's compatible with all the old Portsdown hardware. It will run all the old BATC RF switches, the 4-way switch, the 8-way switch, and the 2-way switch. It's compatible with all those. All the switching is still there. All the band switching is still there. The one thing you would miss is composite video. My suggestion there is use a Pi Zero. They're about $5 each. The SD card to put in it costs about the same, and I'm tempted to come up with something that will do test cards and camera just from a Pi Zero, just as to complement the Portsdown 4. Both the Portsdown 2020 and the 4 will continue to be supported. I didn't make a big fanfare about it, but about a week ago I did a new release for the Portsdown 2020, and it actually, would you believe, improved the MER generated by the filter modulator board. I realized while I was doing some work on the signal generator for the Portsdown 4 that there were some problems with the implementation of the ADF 4351 driver in the Portsdown 2020. And those lessons went back into the new Portsdown 2020 build, and on a really strong signal, the MER of a 23 SEMS Portsdown filter modulator transmission increased from 23 to 24. Nobody's going to notice it, but it makes me feel better that it's the best signal possible coming out of it. So Portsdown 2020 will continue to be supported as long as the stretch operating system is current. We'll have to see how easy or difficult the migration to the new operating system is in probably about a year's time. However, I will be concentrating on all new development on the Portsdown 4, and the reason for that is quite simply that it's got more capability. It gives us more scope to do new things, and we really were running out of grunt on the processing power on Portsdown 2020 using the Raspberry Pi 3. So that sums up my quick run through on Portsdown. I will cease screen sharing now and have a look at the Q&A. So please type your questions in there. Just a thought, how about the Jetson Nano V2? I think that will work well, Justin. Jetson have brought out a Jetson Nano V2, which is cheaper, about £60 versus the £100 for the current Jetson. And I think that could well work well for H.265, but I haven't tried it. Will support for the Lime SDR be discontinued? No, it won't. I have 3 or 4 Lime SDR based systems around. And no, I'm going to keep supporting the Lime SDR, and I'm looking to enhance its capability. Will the RTL Lean DVB receiver make a comeback? Maybe. I was looking at whether I could plumb it into VLC. So it's on the radar. No promises, but maybe. Portsdown 4 wiki. Yes, we need to do some work on the wiki. Documentation for software is always one of those big problems. So yes, the Portsdown 4 wiki will get expanded. Perhaps I need to stop writing software and do some more wiki writing. But if anybody wants to volunteer to start documenting the project, we would really welcome that. Heather asked, is there a reference for all the Pluto mods that we need/want to make? I'd refer you to Paul M0EYT's CQTV article of a couple of CQTVs ago. If you do all the mods in there, it will work. Right. Will there be wiring diagrams for the BAT switches and decode cards, given that the GPIO pin set is different? There is one change. There is a listing of GPIOs on the wiki already, and there is one pin that is changed. The rest are all different, David. I would... version of Raspberry Pi 4 to recommend. I currently use the Raspberry Pi 2 in all my the 2 gigabyte Raspberry Pi in all mine. I do see some applications begin to bubble up that need a 4 or 8. Buy what you can afford, but a 2 works with Portsdown. Is network connected Portsdown connected by Portsdown 4? I don't know. It might be, is a good answer there. I haven't tried it. Please, can somebody try it? You would need to go to menu 3, Pluto config, and enter the IP address and go from there. What does the F5 OEO firmware do for the Pluto? It makes it encode DATV. It is a really substantial upgrade. Hydra 10 gigs adapter. Don't know, Dennis. Don't know about that one, Dennis, whether the Hydra 10 gigs adapter works or not. Right, I'm going to cease answering questions there, and we'll take a quick break for me to get my voice back before Tim starts to talk about the ride. So thank you very much for listening,